Question you have, and I will leave a little time at the end, hopefully, so if you have specific questions, I can answer them. But probably the biggest question you have is sort of where did MacGyver come from? So I'm going to tell you the true story of how MacGyver got created. And then I'll talk a little bit about sort of what he's turned into, although most of you probably have some sense of that anyway. So I have been a television and film writer. At that time I was a television writer, sort of coming up through the ranks. And I had written for a number of existing TV shows, and I was offered an opportunity to write a pilot. As most of you know, television shows start as pilots. You know, somebody comes up with an idea, and then that gets turned into a script, and then eventually the networks decide whether or not they want to turn it into a television show. And I was told by my agent at the time that this had already been sold. I didn't have to sell anything. It was done. All I needed to do was sort of come in and write the script. I was really just going to be sort of a writer for hire. I said, great, that's great. So I was brought in, and they said, okay, here's the idea that we sold to ABC. It's called Hourglass. I said, sounds cool. And they said, and here's the gimmick. The gimmick is that an hour of television time is a real hour. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, the whole show takes place in a real hour. Now, flash forward many years, there's a show now called 24, which theoretically each hour of the show is, but in that time, every show had to stand alone. They didn't want a serial, you know, where it kind of continued from week to week. They wanted every show to stand alone and be a separate thing. And I said, you know what, I know I'm just the guy who's supposed to write this, but I got to tell you, we have a problem. They said, what do you mean? And I said, well, the problem is, an hour is not a lot of time. What if he has to go somewhere? I mean, you know, if he has to go across town. They said, well, he knows the buses and he can jump on the back of buses. I said, you can't do it. You have to start the drama where it's going to play out. And I can think of like 5 shows. The bank vault show, the sinking ship show, you know, the mine shaft show. I said, after that, you're going to choke to death on this idea because, you know, he can't go anywhere. All the things that make, you know, movies and television, being able to jump time and space, I said, you're giving all that away and this isn't going to work. Well, so naturally they got mad at me because they said, well, we already sold this. And I can understand why. It sounded great in the room, you know? I mean, you go in, you're sitting across from an executive, and you say, 1 hour of showtime is 1 hour of real time. He goes, great, that's because none of them actually have to do it, you know? So here I was the guy who actually had to make this, and I said, it's not going to work. If you want a series that's going to last, this isn't going to do it. Well, they said, well, we're not going to unsell this show, so you have to come up with something else. Okay, so we're already moving into the MacGyver zone of, I'm in a tight spot, I got to get myself out, what am I going to do? So I came up with one idea, went to the networks, nah, they didn't like that one. And I came up with another idea, went to the network, nah, they didn't like that one. I said, okay, now I got to get out of this gig somehow, and I'm going to have to write my way out of this gig. So I called all my writer friends together, and I said, guys, I'm in a tight spot. I burst their balloon, and now, you know, now I somehow got to make the balloon, you know, refill the balloon that's already been burst. And as many of you who know physics know, this is a very tricky problem. So we started kicking around a variety of ideas, and I had always had a Swiss Army knife because my father had given me a Swiss Army knife. We'll get back to my father in a moment. And one of them said, well, suppose instead of having all those gadgets that James Bond has, suppose he just finds things around. And I said, you know, that's a great idea. And we started playing with that idea. And then we started expanding on it. And by the way, if he doesn't carry a gun, then he has to figure out a way out of the situation. Because otherwise, you know, you got a gun, your first impulse is start shooting, right? They say, well, if we take the gun away, he's going to be forced to do something else. And then we kind of said, okay, he needs a name. And I said, well, he should be a guy. I mean, like a real guy. Let's just call him Guy. And they all said, no, that's not going to work. And I said, okay, so what can we do with it? Well, at that time, those of you who are old enough remember that McDonald's used to post how many hamburgers they sold. You know, like 1 billion sold, 2 billion sold. At some point, I think they realized people were going to start translating that back into cows. And so they went, you know what, this is going to get ugly, so let's just go away from there. But at that time, anything that was uniquely popular got a Mac put in front of it. So USA Today came out and people called it McNewspaper. And it was McThis and McThat. So I said, well, okay, let's just call him MacGyver, you know? And somebody said, no, that you need 3 syllables. 2-syllable name doesn't work. 3 syllables. So played some more and finally came up with MacGyver. Said, that's a great name. We got a gimmick. I'm all set. Went into the network and they said, you know, you can write that one. Oh, finally. All right. So I sat down to write this and I began working with the idea, obviously. And I realized as I was starting to write that I was really writing my father. My father was a really unique and interesting individual. He had been trained as a teacher, went off into the war, unfortunately suffered terrible trauma, I think, in the war, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. In those days, they didn't really have a name for it. And the way my father coped when he eventually got out of the war was, we grew up on the East Coast. In the East Coast, everybody had a basement. I mean, sometimes you have a basement on the West Coast, but generally you don't have a lot of basements. Well, in the basement, he went down into the basement, and every day after, he was a New York City junior high school shop teacher. And every day he would come home from his shop teaching job, and he would go down to the basement. And he could build anything. I mean, this would be heaven to him, while he's still alive and here to enjoy it. Because whether it was electrical, whether it was plumbing, whether it was woodworking, whether it was metalworking, and my father had a wall easily that size with every size screw, nail, nut, you name it. I mean, he just had all the tools and the toys of somebody who spends his life making things. And that's what he did. He restored antiques. He had a huge antique tool collection. And he was the person who, when I was maybe 12 years old, benighted me with a Swiss Army knife and said, this is a good tool. You should keep one with you all the time. I would have brought it with me, but unfortunately, if I got on the plane, they would have taken it away from me. So I wasn't able to bring it with me to show it to you, but, well, that's the FAA today, guys. What can I tell you? So I realized as I was writing that to a large extent, my father was really the inspiration for this character because when anything broke, he would be the guy you called to fix it. All my relatives, all our neighbors, you know, get Arnold, because Arnold will know how to fix it. And I realized that this was my father, and to a large extent, I think, even the fact of his trauma in World War II, because when I was a kid growing up, you know, war was fascinating. He would never discuss his involvement in the war. He would never look at war movies or read war books or watch a television show about the World War II. I mean, I didn't know what my father did in World War II until after he died. And I found out he had been a medic in World War II. And then after having suffered what then they called shell shock, they then sent him, he came home for a brief time, married my mother, and then they sent him back, but they put him in the artillery because I guess they thought that would be less traumatic than having to deal with guys who were obviously in the trenches or on the battlefield, and you're having to try and patch them up and put them back together. So to a large extent, really, in many ways, MacGyver was really, in some sense, an homage or the embodiment of my father.